Warning: the following story contains themes of emotional distress and self-deletion. Viewer discretion is advised. The man was dressed in funeral attire, all in black, walking to the funeral home down the block, keeping his gaze lowered to the sidewalk. A few days before, while the man, whose name was Terry, was at home watching TV, his mother was working at the bank when a stick-up occurred. His mother, thinking she could be the hero against three masked men with AK-47s, stalled and tried to give the police time to appear, if any police were indeed coming. Suddenly, she had attacked one of the criminals, and she was shot multiple times, the bullets hitting her and the criminal she attacked. Terry's mother was still alive when she hit the floor, and she muttered something nobody heard. Then her body jolted as one of the two criminals put a bullet in her head. Her blood pooled beneath her body, and it framed her head like a halo. The remaining criminals were never caught. When Terry got the phone call about his mother, the news devastated him, and he began to sob. He rushed outside to his car and demanded over the phone to know where she had been taken, and was told she was currently at the hospital. He immediately drove over there, almost getting a ticket from a cop in the process, only to find it was too late. She was dead. Terry now stood in front of the funeral home, in front of its door. A display next to the door listed upcoming viewings. The first name read Sophia Colano. Terry took a deep breath and walked in. The threadbare red carpet and dark wood paneling made the whole place seem somehow even more depressing to Terry than it already was. Terry entered the first room. A few stained glass windows resided on the back wall, and rows of folding chairs faced a closed coffin set on the dais. The room was empty, save for him. Terry wasn't surprised the room was empty. He hadn't expected to see anyone else at his mother's funeral but himself. After all, Sophia Colano was considered a failure. Oh, no, not by Terry, Paris thought. Sophia had a strict family, if the word strict meant cruel, which Terry supposed was his family too. Sophia Colano's family did not care for Sophia Colano, because she had a child with a man who ditched her when she was still a child. They considered her a failure, an embarrassment, not part of her own family anymore. They rejected and abandoned her, which Terry thought was pretty fucked up. You didn't do that to a family member unless they deserved it. And Sophia Colano definitely did not deserve it. It wasn't right, the way she was treated. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't as if she was the person robbing the bank. She tried to be a hero. It just wasn't fair. Tears filled Terry's eyes. Wildly wiping them, he walked over to the coffin on the dais, which was closed. The coffin's wood was dark and glossy. A large portrait of his mother was sat next to the coffin. She looked so happy in the picture, so carefree. Terry stood there, trying to remember his mother as she had been. Her sparkling green eyes, her pale complexion, the smell of her wavy brown hair, the jovial sound of her voice. Terry gripped the coffin. He got choked up when he tried to speak, then spoke. "Hi, Mom," he said. For a few seconds, he couldn't say anymore. He merely stared at his mother's portrait, sniffling. Then he found his voice again. I miss you. You were all I had as family. No aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, nieces. At least none I know or ever will talk to. It wasn't fair, what happened to you. And I now realize that life isn't always fair. It isn't always forgiving. Life goes on, even as bad things happen, such as your death. All these bad things happen every single day, even as all these good things happen simultaneously to other people, constant and continuous. It's almost as if life chooses what things people live through daily. Almost as if it has a reason for the people who lives it, chooses to manipulate. And if there's a reason for this, for what happened to you, then I must ask life, why? Why did you have to lose your life to a trio of criminals? Why did the criminals get away with murdering you? Why did a good person have to lose their life while the bad ones lived on? Bad things seem to happen to the best of people. And I ask again, why? What did you do to deserve the crappy life you had? What did you do to deserve this? Terry gestured around wildly, indicating the funeral home. Why did I have to lose my mother when I didn't do anything to deserve such a punishment? I just don't get it. Terry whispered the last part, laying his forehead onto the cool wood of the coffin. But now I'm thinking, what if you wanted some way out of this crappy soundtrack that is your life, and you saw it, and took the opportunity? What if your fucked up life was too much to bear? What if you thought you really were a failure, and wanted a way out from all the criticism? In that case, if that is the case, I suppose I should be a bit reassured that you got what you truly wanted. Though I certainly don't feel reassured about it. You're in a better place now, I suppose. A happier place. A place where life has no hold over you because you're not held down by life anymore. You've given up on life and have therefore passed on. Which also means... He began to cry. You've also given up on me. Tears made their way down his face, and a hoarse sob exited his throat. His forehead remained pressed against the coffin's surface. For a few minutes, that's all he did. Sobbed quietly with his forehead pressed against the cool wood. Then he straightened, wiped his face, and said, Well, I suppose you got what you wanted. That's the case. And if not, well, you're still in a better place now, I suppose. But before I go, let me see your face one more time. Terry leaned over, grabbed the coffin lid, and lifted it. And he gasped quietly. The coffin was empty. Terry backed away in horror. She wasn't there. But that didn't make any sense. If his mother was really dead, then where's the body? A small but heavy thump reverberated from behind him, and Terry spun around and stared, his eyes wide in utter horror. On the ground about 7 feet in front of him was the object of his horror. It lay sprawled where it had fallen, struggling to stand back up and continue its approach. It was his dead mother. His deceased mother struggled meekly on the ground, as if it wasn't used to moving its limbs, as if its movement were a struggle for it. Blood slathered her face red from the crimson liquid trickling forth from a bullet hole on her forehead. Gun wounds ravaged across her side, stomach, and breast oozed blood and stained her torn, hanging shirt red, blood wetting the floor in small red pools and streaks. She managed to get her knees, moving stiffly and unnaturally, revealing her ravaged torso clearly, torn flaps of ripped skin hanging loosely and dark, meaty red holes trickling scarlet down her pale flesh. A fleshy hole coated her face crimson from her forehead. Skin that wasn't slathered in blood was as pale as death, her lips a chalky white, her eyes milky and unfocused, staring blindly ahead of her. When she finally managed to stiffly stagger to her feet, Terry was still staring at her in horror. His deceased mother simply stood there, her clothes stained in crimson blood and torn from the conditions of her death. Her chest was still, meaning she wasn't breathing. She swayed slightly on her feet. Her eyes almost seemed to focus on him, but not quite. Terry continued to stare at his mother's deceased self, believing, but not quite believing, his eyes. Mom? Terry managed to choke out. It's you? She continued to stand there. Was she mute? Maybe she was mute, Terry thought. Technically, she should be, since she was dead. Terry couldn't stand to see his mother in such a horrid condition. Actually, he couldn't stand to see her at all because guilt still plagued him, like a 10-ton anvil that he hadn't been there to protect him. Terry waited for his mother to do something. Anything. But she just continued to stand there. Her unfocused staring was beginning to unnerve him. That's funny. As if everything else about this predicament wasn't already unnerving. This was downright freaky. Shouldn't her wounds have been tended to and stitched up by the doctors? Shouldn't her torn up clothes have been replaced for the funeral? Why is she here? Terry thought. Besides for the fact that she's dead, of course. Terry knew that spirits tended to come back from the dead and haunt people or places when they're disturbed or something important to them was left behind in the living world. But their physical body? What reason did his mother have to come back from the dead? Did she think that somehow something needed her attention? Or had she come for him? Terry jumped. His mother had made an inquisitive sound from deep in her throat. Her eyes seemed to stare directly into his soul. She lifted her arms slowly in his direction, moaning like the undead corpse she was, and took a stiff-legged, wobbly step forward. Her arms were held stiffly outwards, as if reaching for him. Terry felt he couldn't move. She took another step forward, then another, then another. She was less than 3 feet away from him now. She was close enough now to where he could smell her deceasement. He could see the milky cataracts in her eyes, each torn flap of skin and clothes, the white chalkiness of her lips, her pale as death complexion, almost in perfect clarity. She took another step forward. She was right in front of him now, her arms held to each side of him, close enough to grab him, if she desired it. Close enough to just grab. And she wrapped her arms around him. Terry stood stock still in shock for a few moments, his mother's deceased arms stiff with rigor mortis, wrapped around him in a hug, and Terry then realized what had been in his mother's milky eyes as she had approached him. It was helpless, unbridled love toward her one and only living son. His mother's love was evident even after death. Her love for him, living on even after life, had loosed its hold on her. Terry's arms reached out and embraced his deceased mother. Terry's mother let out a satisfied sound deep in her throat, just a sort of grunt, but to Terry it sounded like, "Live." Then her arms went limp around his neck, and she slid limply from his embrace without a sound. Terry tried to grab his mother as she fell, but she hit the floor with a soft thud before he could get a tight grip on her, and blood lightly splattered the floor. His mother's blood now wet his clothes, but to this he paid no mind. Instead, he kneeled by his mother's limp body. It seemed as lifeless as a corpse should be, and when he grabbed his mother's hand, it was ice cold, almost as if she'd never been. Looking at his mother's face, he saw an expression of abysmal peace had taken over, as if she now had nothing to worry about anymore. No struggles, no worries, just satisfaction and peace, and a small smile had formed on her lips, a smile of love and acceptance. And it was then that a realization hit him. His mother had stayed in her body, still enduring great pains from her death wounds, until this exact moment. She waited until she could give one more embrace to her mourning son, and her mourning son could give one more loving embrace to her. And as soon as she was reassured of her satisfaction, she left her body one last time, this time for good, after showing Terry that she still loved him, that she didn't blame him for not being there for her at her death, that she still loved him after death, that she'd done what she had done for a reason, done what she had done while knowing the consequences. And with this realization came a kind of release of Terry's fears, a kind of relief that filled his soul, his being, with unquenchable love for his mother, replacing all the guilt and regret that plagued him like a sickness, invading his mind. Terry's being was now filled with reassurance that it hadn't been his fault that she had died, that she was just at the wrong place at the wrong time, and that his mother was in a better place, a place certainly better than the one she'd left. It was like a 10-ton anvil was released from his shoulders. Terry gripped the pale, cold flesh of his mother's hand and remembered. It was as if the long-forgotten memory thrust itself at him. His mother, sitting on the couch, reading a book while Terry, who was 9 years old at the time, made his mother a picture on the floor with his crayons and paper. They had both been silent as they concentrated, Sophia on her book and Terry on his picture. And his mother had remarked, seeming out of the blue, "You know, Terry, there's a better place out there." Terry looked up from his coloring, startled, and asked, And where is this place, Mom?" And Sophia had put down her book and looked at him with a smile on her young, pretty face. And she replied, "Up." Terry was confused. "Are you talking about the sky, Mom?" And Sophia had laughed at Terry's question. But it wasn't a mean laugh. It didn't make him feel stupid. It was light and carefree, lilting. It made him feel privileged. "No," his mother had replied. "I mean up, when we exit this world and go on to the next. It's not a place you can simply pack your bags and travel to, though I suppose some people wish it was. It is a better place than any other, certainly this place. Terry, it's a utopia of utopias, a place only the privileged may enter." Terry stared at his mother in confusion. Her words seemed to reverberate through every nerve, every nucleus of every atom, every molecule of his body. But he didn't know exactly what she meant. Her sudden outburst had caught him by surprise, though he couldn't imagine why. She was always telling him new stuff, sometimes cool, sometimes not. But no matter what she was talking about, he always listened. But this time seemed somehow different, somehow as if she was trying to prepare him for something, albeit something many years in the future, though he didn't know at the time. "How can you get there?" he asked intently, noting her expression was one he did not like. It was solemn and melancholy, somewhat sad and ultimately thoughtful. His mother did not answer at first, so Terry waited. His mother stared off into the distance with that expression he didn't like upon her beautiful features for a full 10 seconds. And then she replied in a soft voice, "When you rise." Terry stared hard at her, and something had clicked in him at that moment. Something so far in him he didn't even notice it, perhaps in his subconscious. He looked at the picture he was making, and then his mother's far-off expression, then at his work of art again, and he loudly crumpled it up. His mother glanced at him, startled, as Terry threw the paper ball to the side, where it rolled and hit the couch. Terry pretended to crack his knuckles, then pretended to crack his neck, got another blank sheet of paper, and got to work. It was about 20 minutes later when he set down the last nub of crayon he was using and sighed satisfactorily. He took his pencil, signed his meaningful masterpiece with his name, and tossed the pencil to the side. He stared at his art for a few moments, chewing his thumbnail, then stood up with the paper in his hands. The expression he didn't like, after 20 minutes, was still upon his mother's musing face. And he walked up towards her, and she looked at him. "What's that you got there?" Sophia Colano asked, her melancholy expression breaking momentarily into a smile at the sight of her son. 9-year-old Terry handed his mother the picture he'd worked so hard on, watching his mother's face for a reaction. It was a very detailed drawing with lots of vibrant colors, filled with clouds like fluff of cotton candy. Yellow stars ranging in multitude from large and small, large round planets with rings and moons and asteroids and cities. UFOs ranging in wild shapes and sizes, with extraterrestrial co-pilots and inhabitants. Shooting stars flying through it all. A couple of bright swirling galaxies, flying birds, airplanes, and multicolored balloons floating through it all. But the biggest and most notable thing in the entire picture was a single 2-letter word in big bubble letters, colored with every color imaginable, tie-dye style. Up. Sophia Colano stared at it for a few seconds, then burst into laughter and pulled 9-year-old Terry to her in an embrace, wrapping her arms around him with the drawing in one hand. And for a reason Terry didn't quite understand, there were tears in her eyes, and now they were making their way down her face in wet streams. But she was still smiling. "Oh dear," Sophia told her son. "How I love you, Terry. Thank you." Then she kissed him on the forehead, and Terry realized, with a great happiness and satisfaction, that the melancholy, thoughtful expression that had been on his mother's face was gone, and was replaced with one much more desirable to Terry. It was one of blissful glee at having Terry as her child, at being with her child at this happy moment, and being able to spend time with him, talk with him, laugh with him, live with him. The memory finished its flashback in his head, and Terry gripped his mother's cold hand harder, and his eyes filled with tears once more. But they weren't just tears of sadness and longing this time. They were also tears of happiness and joy for his mother, for she was in the very utopia of utopias she'd told him about so many years ago. A utopia meant for the privileged of the privileged, the chosen of the chosen, the risen of the risen. She went up, and by doing so, she'd left him behind. Terry sighed, his cheeks wet with tears. It doesn't matter, he thought, if she's left me behind or not. She's reached the final reward, the reward of rewards. And Terry couldn't help but feel happy for her. Wiping his cheeks, Terry somehow knew with certainty what was meant to be done. Terry picked up his mother's corpse, noting sadly that his mother's body seemed to weigh next to nothing. Then, with a kind of ritual feeling, he slowly walked to the coffin, which was about 2 feet behind him. Then, with her arms and legs and head dangling limply, her hair a hanging shower of brown, he slowly lowered his mother's body into the soft, velvety cushion of the coffin's interior. Without gratitude, he realized he'd gotten his mother's crimson blood on his hands, and he lightly wiped them on his black dress shirt. Leaning over, Terry propped his mother's hands on her chest and straightened her head and legs, properly setting her long hair under her body instead of the halo it resembled around her head. Then, he slowly closed her eyes. Terry stood there for a few minutes over his mother's coffin, staring down at his mother's peaceful, satisfied expression. She's happier now, he thought. Yeah. In a better place than this currently crappy one. A place certainly more utopian than the one she'd left. Yeah. Of course. Certainly. She's been rewarded. Yeah. Rewarded. but that didn't stop him from missing her. Terry sighed again. He's not going to see his mother again for a long time. Unless... Terry mused on an idea that surfaced from within the depths of his mind. 2 funerals, buried side by side. I'll be able to see her again. Terry began to smile, but his mouth faltered mid-smile. What? Had he seriously been considering suicide? My God, Terry thought. Good Lord. If there's any way to insult his mother's passing, committing suicide was it. She had used the last amount of energy she had to stay in the living realm to see him one last time, when she could have already been receiving her eternal reward. She'd endured the undoubtable excruciating pains of her death wounds, so he could see and embrace her one last time. She'd rejected the utopia of utopias for a short while, just so she could remind him to live, and he was going to insult that by killing himself? Terry was mortified. He stared at his mother's peaceful expression. It would have been extremely rude to kill himself when his mother's spirit had personally visited him to remind him to live on. She probably would have scolded him as soon as he'd reached the afterlife. She would have been disappointed in him. Terry leaned over and kissed his mother's forehead. Her flesh felt cool on his lips. I love you, Mom, Terry whispered. He then straightened, turned around, and began walking to the door. His footsteps made quiet pats in the still air as he walked, and he made sure his feet avoided contact with his mother's blood. When he reached the door, he looked back one more time, and the place seemed a little more welcome than before, and he walked out. As he exited the room, he heard a rustling sound at his feet, and when he looked down, he spotted the paper under his foot, a strangely familiar paper, and he bent down and picked it up to look at it. He stared at the paper for a few moments, simply unbelieving. It was a very detailed picture, with lots of color and not a single space bare or plain, decorated with a large assortment of things that resided in the air and space. It was wrinkled and yellowing, the edges curled from age, but it was obvious that whoever had made this picture had put their time and effort into it. In the middle of the paper were 2 large letters, colored tie-dye style. Up. On the corner of the page was a child's lettering, a signature, spelling out the name Terry. Terry stared at the paper in disbelief. He hadn't seen this picture in over 15 years. And now, here it was, practically unscathed, if not a bit worn with age. It was unbelievable. Terry looked left, then right, trying to spot whoever had put the picture there, but somehow knowing what he would see. The long hallway of doors was empty. Terry looked at the picture again. Looking at the picture he'd made over 15 years ago was making him feel nostalgic for the simple life of his 9-year-old self. He would do nearly anything to return to the life of his childhood, where he had still lived with his beloved mother, albeit only loved by him, sadly. And indeed, among the commingled feelings that arose in him at the sight of this picture, he felt genuine sadness, as well as a deep longing for the simplicities of his childhood life. Despite having to listen to whatever an adult told him to do, life was practically bliss, particularly so because of Sophia Colano being his mother, and not having to worry over what an adult would fret about, such as bills and payday, and who's going to take the shift for Friday night, which was something his mother had fretted over multiple times, particularly because she ended up taking the shift on Friday nights most of the time, causing Terry to watch Friday Night Football alone. But even though he had to deal with the occasional bully and endure the sound of his mother crying in her bedroom, life as a child was miraculous, uncomplicated, and Terry yearned for such uncomplication. Because if his current 27-year-old life harbored such uncomplication, then he would be able to enjoy life and enjoy himself as he used to be able to. without sorrow and mourning and sadness that now plagued his life like cancer, slowly eating away until there's nothing left but cold, dead flesh. But now, the sight of this long-lost coloring from a childhood long gone arose in him another realization, one that filled him from head to toe, that complications are meant to make you stronger, that complications aid you in learning how to get past obstacles and hardships, that complications are meant to be conquered, if not right away. They make you a better person, one more able to withstand troubles than someone who's always had their life laid out for them the way they want it. They make you into someone people admire and want to be around. They make you into someone likable, if not immediately. Hardships are meant to be. All of this is what arose in Terry at the sight of this drawing. And one more thing momentarily took over his thoughts, and that is what he had been thinking at the time he made the drawing. I love my mom. Without her, I would not be. My mom had been when I was not. She will continue to be when I am not again. And I am afraid I may lose her someday, and it makes me want to cry, because maybe she wants to be rid of me. The last thought struck home in Terry's head, a reminder of all the times Terry had been plagued with doubt. Maybe I'm just a reminder of her failure. Tears stung Terry's eyes as he remembered the strangely mature thoughts that had filled his head when he was 9. Even though he knew it wasn't true, ill-bred guilt still arose in him at the thought that he had been the cause of his mother's failure with her family. Terry traced the letter U, then the letter P, slowly with his finger. He could remember the emotion that filled him when his mother had reacted the way she did to this picture. It was pure relief that his mother still loved him, that his mother didn't blame him for what her family thought of her. He remembered feeling so happy as his mother hugged him, and his hands rested tightly on her back, as he felt the comforting push. I don't want to read that. I'm sorry. That just makes me uncomfortable. As he felt the comforting push of his mother's breasts on his arm, and heard the jovial laugh that erupted from her mouth, as he felt her warm lips press against his forehead, and heard the words he so loved to come out of her mouth. Oh dear, how I love you, Terry. Thank you. She said she still loved him, and she thanked him. Terry, wiping his eyes, turned around and strode back into the room, approaching the coffin and dais. When he stood in front of it, he looked at his mother's peaceful face. It was almost possible to convince himself she was merely sleeping. He looked at the picture in his hand, then his mother's corpse, then the picture in his hand. Thank you, Mom, Terry whispered. When he walked out, it was in his mother's hands. The story's over. Shouldn't the outro be playing? Well, no. There is one last thing I'd like to leave you on with this story. At the end of it, there's a note written by the author, Camren. I'd like to read it to you. Thank you for reading my story. I worked really hard on this. I've been writing for years, and I've gotten much better than when I first started. Thank you for reading my work. I plan on being an author, and I hope this impressed you guys like the finished product impressed me. And my grandma, is watching me. Can you say hi? Okay. Now I'll let you go. Thank you for watching. Or listening.